The first ball of the season at Lady Whitmore's was a catastrophe of light. 300 candles in the chandeliers, 400 guests in silk and embroidered muslin, and Margaret Ellsworth standing at the eastern wall in a gown her aunt had altered from last year's lavender. The seams let out at the bodice and taken in at the waist, so that the fabric puckered where it ought to have lain flat. She held her hands at her sides. She did not touch the puckered seam. She had learned, in the 3 weeks since her arrival in London, that drawing attention to a flaw was worse than wearing it. Across the room, Lady Bromley leaned close to her daughter Cecilia and said, in the carrying whisper she used when she wished to be overheard by exactly 3 people, "Do not stand near your cousin tonight. The plain one will make you look ordinary by association, and Halford is here." Cecilia had the grace to flinch. Margaret did not, because she had not heard the words, only seen her aunt's mouth move and her cousin's eyes drop. She knew the shape of that conversation. She had known it since she was 14. What she did not know, could not have known, was that the Duke of Halford was watching her from the far side of the room. Not Cecilia in her ivory silk. Not the Bancroft sisters in their matched pearls. Her. His gaze had found the place where the lavender seam puckered at her ribs, had tracked the specific stillness of her hands at her sides, and had not moved. He stood with a glass of wine he had not tasted, and his face gave nothing away. He had not danced in 2 years. No one expected him to begin tonight. If you have ever watched a room full of people fail to see someone worth seeing, then you already know where this is going. Stay close. Margaret Ellsworth was 23 years old and had been, until 18 months ago, the daughter of the Reverend James Ellsworth of Hartfield in Wiltshire, a man who had taught her Greek before she was 10 and given her his own copy of Cowper's poems with his annotations in the margins, written in an ink so fine it looked like the veins of a pressed leaf. The Reverend Ellsworth had died of a fever in November of 1812, and with him had died the living, the cottage, the small library with its south-facing window, and every material certainty Margaret had ever possessed. Her mother had preceded him by 6 years. There was no brother. There was no entail that might have been contested, because there was no property to entail. There was only Lady Bromley, her mother's elder sister, who had written a letter of condolence that arrived 4 days after the funeral, and contained, between the conventional sentiments, an offer. Margaret would come to London. She would serve as companion to Cecilia during the season. She would receive £40 for her keep and the use of whatever gowns Cecilia had outgrown or tired of. In exchange, she would make herself useful, which meant she would be visible enough to fill a chair, and invisible enough never to fill a doorway when Cecilia was passing through it. Margaret had accepted. She had packed her father's Cowper into the bottom of her trunk, beneath the stockings and the one good chemise, and she had come to London and learned, with the speed of someone who has no margin for error, exactly where she stood in Lady Bromley's household. She stood where she was placed. She wore what she was given. She did not speak at supper unless spoken to, did not enter the drawing-room before Cecilia, did not sit until her aunt had chosen her own chair. Her room was on the 3rd floor, at the back, where the servants' staircase met the linen closet, and the window looked out onto the mews rather than the square. The bed was narrow, and the mattress was horsehair, and the single blanket was wool so thin she could see the weave of it when she held it to the light. Each morning she rose before Cecilia, pressed Cecilia's ribbons with the flat iron the housemaid left on the landing, laid out Cecilia's gloves in order of formality, and waited in the hall until her aunt summoned her to breakfast, where she sat at the foot of the table and ate whatever the cook had set aside after the family had been served. On Tuesdays, she mended. On Thursdays, she wrote Lady Bromley's correspondence in the hand her father had taught her, which was finer than Lady Bromley's own, and this small superiority was never mentioned and never forgiven. The book of Cowper's poems she kept in her room, on the small table beside her narrow bed, and she read from it each night by a single candle that she paid for herself out of the £40. Her father's handwriting in the margins was the only voice left in the world that had ever told her she was remarkable. The season's machinery had been calibrated for Cecilia. Lady Bromley had invested £400 in gowns, 200 in gloves and fans and dancing shoes, and the whole of her social capital in a campaign to place her daughter in the path of the Duke of Halford, who was 31, unmarried for the second time in a way that carried weight rather than scandal, and possessed of £12,000 a year and an estate in Derbyshire called Ashworth Park that the guidebooks described as severe and the county families described as magnificent. He was also possessed of a reputation for coldness so thorough that the Ton had stopped calling it grief and started calling it temperament. He did not dance. He did not call on anyone. He attended events because his rank required it and departed them before the supper was laid, and his face, which was handsome in the way that carved stone is handsome, remained composed throughout. Lady Bromley had decided that Cecilia's warmth would thaw him. She had not considered that warmth. When it arrives uninvited, sometimes looks like noise. Margaret watched the season unfold from the edges of rooms. She fetched Cecilia's fan when it fell. She held Lady Bromley's shawl when the drawing rooms grew warm. She stood at walls and counted the candles, and noticed, because noticing was the only freedom left to her, that the Duke of Halford was not cold. He was careful. There was a difference. A cold man would not have caught a servant's elbow when the girl stumbled on the Whitmore staircase. A cold man would not have spoken to old Lady Fenwick for 9 full minutes at the Bancroft supper when no one else had spoken to her all evening. A cold man would not have paused, as he had paused tonight, at the edge of the dance floor, and looked across the room at a woman in an ill-fitting lavender gown with the particular attention of someone who has recognized something he was not expecting to find. Margaret did not see him looking. She was reading the candle count. She had reached 212. He left before the supper. He always did. On his way to the door, he passed close enough to her that she could smell the rain still caught in the wool of his coat. And she heard him say to his companion, in a voice so low it was nearly swallowed by the music, "Who is the woman in lavender?" His companion, Lord Fenton, glanced at Margaret and said, "Nobody. The Bromley cousin, plain as a church wall." Halford said nothing. He adjusted his glove and walked into the night, and Margaret stood at the wall and felt the draught from the opened door move across the bare skin of her wrists, and did not know that she had just been asked about. The following Tuesday, Lady Bromley took Cecilia and Margaret to the Pemberton garden party in Kensington. The roses were in early bloom, and Mrs. Pemberton had arranged the seating so that the most eligible men in attendance would pass Cecilia's bench on their way to the refreshments. It was, Lady Bromley said in the carriage, a masterwork of positioning. Margaret's position was at the far end of the garden, near the yew hedge, where Lady Fenwick sat alone with a plate of seed cake she could not eat because her hands shook too badly to manage the fork. Margaret sat beside her and cut the cake into small pieces and fed them to her one at a time. And when Lady Fenwick asked her to read something, anything, Margaret took out her father's Cowper and read aloud in a voice pitched low enough that the old woman could hear it through the deafness in her left ear without the rest of the garden hearing it at all. She read for 20 minutes. She did not see the Duke of Halford standing at the turn of the yew hedge, 6 feet away, his hand arrested on the gate latch, listening. He had come looking for Lady Fenwick, who was his godmother. He had found Margaret instead, her voice steady and patient, her fingers turning the pages of a book whose binding was cracked and whose margins were filled with a handwriting that was not her own. He watched her lift a piece of seed cake to Lady Fenwick's mouth with the same care she might have used to tend a wound. He watched her close the book and press her palm flat against the cover, as though she were holding someone's hand. He stood there long enough for the shadow to move. Then he stepped back around the hedge and returned to the garden by the longer path, and no one knew he had been there at all. No one except the gardener's boy, who was not important enough to tell. In the garden proper, Mrs. Pemberton was holding court near the rose arbor. Cecilia was beside her, laughing at something Lord Fenton had said, and Lady Bromley was positioned at Cecilia's shoulder like a warship at anchor. When Margaret returned from the yew garden, her father's book tucked beneath her arm. Mrs. Pemberton looked her over with the frank assessment of a woman who had been beautiful at 20 and intended to remain authoritative at 50. "Lady Bromley," she said, loud enough for the surrounding chairs to hear, "how charitable of you to bring the plain one along. Every diamond needs its setting, I suppose, and your Cecilia does shine brighter when there is something dull beside her." The laughter that followed was not unkind. It was worse than unkind. It was automatic, the sound of people agreeing with a verdict they had not troubled themselves to examine. Margaret's hand tightened on the spine of the cowper. Her face did not change. She had heard worse in Hartfield, from women who had fewer words and more conviction. She took her seat at the edge of the party and placed the book in her lap and set her hands flat upon it. And her pulse, which had climbed into her throat, slowed by degrees until she could feel the leather binding warm beneath her fingers and remember whose handwriting was inside. What she did not see was the Duke of Halford, now standing at the far end of the rose walk, his face turned toward Mrs. Pemberton with an expression that was not cold and was not angry, and was something far more dangerous to a woman of Mrs. Pemberton's ambitions. It was the expression of a man who has just learned something he will not forget. The following week, Halford attended the Cavendish musical. Margaret was there in her capacity as Cecilia's companion, seated in the back row where companions sat, her hands folded in her lap, and her father's book in her reticule, because she never went anywhere without it. Cecilia was in the third row, wearing the pearl earrings Lady Bromley had borrowed from a friend, and Lady Bromley was beside her, scanning the room for the Duke's dark head. She found it in the last row. She did not find it beside Cecilia. He was seated 4 chairs from Margaret, on the aisle. And when the soprano began the second aria, Margaret felt the quality of the air change in the way it changes when someone is looking at you, with the full weight of their attention, and does not intend to stop. She did not turn her head. Her breath shortened. She pressed her thumb against the edge of her glove and felt the ridge of the seam, and told herself it was the music. Only the music that had made the room feel smaller. At the interval, he stood. He crossed the 4 chairs between them in 2 strides, and he said, without preamble, without introduction, without any of the preparatory social architecture that a duke was meant to employ when addressing a woman he had not been formally presented to, "Miss Ellsworth, come inside. The terrace doors are open, and you are sitting in the draught." She looked up at him. His face was level, composed, utterly without warmth. His eyes were the color of rain on slate. "I am quite well, Your Grace," she said. "You are shivering," he said. She was. She had not noticed until he named it. He did not offer his arm. He did not smile. He turned and walked toward the interior doors, and after a moment she stood and followed him, because the alternative was to sit in the draught and pretend she was not cold when a man who could see she was cold had told her to come inside. In the small anteroom beyond the music room, he stood by the fire and said, "Sit down, Miss Ellsworth. You have been on your feet since 4. She sat, because her legs were tired, and he was right, and she did not have the energy to argue with a man whose rank made argument a species of performance she could not afford. He did not sit. He stood at the mantel, one hand resting on the marble, and looked at the fire as though it had asked him a question he was considering whether to answer. "Your book," he said. "The one you carry." "Cowper." She looked down at her reticule. "You read from it to Lady Fenwick at the Pemberton Garden." Her breath stopped. She felt the heat of the fire on her face and could not tell if the warmth in her cheeks was the flame or the sudden understanding that he had been watching her that day in the yew garden and that she had not known. "It was my father's," she said. She had not meant to say that. She had meant to say something polished and deflecting, something a companion ought to say to a duke who had noticed too much. He looked at her. The firelight moved across the line of his jaw, and for a single-held moment his composure cracked. Not in his face, which remained still, but in his hand, which moved to the left side of his chest and pressed flat against his waistcoat, in the place where a man might keep something small and heavy close to his heart. "I understand," he said. He did not explain what he understood. He withdrew his hand from his chest and looked at the fire again, and Margaret sat in the warm chair with her father's book in her lap and felt, for the first time in 18 months, that someone in the world could see her. She did not see it yet. You might. If this story is already pulling at something in you, leave a quiet word in the comments, and stay. That night, after the music hall, Margaret lay in her narrow bed and pressed her palm against the Cowper and tried to understand what had happened. She had been sitting in a draught. A duke had told her to come inside. He had known about the book. He had pressed his hand to his own chest as though something there hurt him. She could not make it mean what her body had already decided it meant, because her body was wrong. Her body had been wrong before, in Hartfield, when the curate's son had paid her attention for 3 months, and then married the brewer's daughter. And her aunt had said, not unkindly, "My dear, you must not expect attention. You have not the face for it." She turned onto her side and closed her eyes and felt the leather of the book against her fingertips and reminded herself that a duke who had not danced in 2 years did not begin to see a vicar's plain daughter because he had watched her feed seed cake to an old woman. That was not how the world arranged itself. She was wrong about him. She had to be. She was not wrong about him. Edward Ashworth, the 5th Duke of Halford, had not danced in 2 years because 2 years ago his wife Charlotte had died in the upstairs bedroom of Ashworth Park, while he sat in a committee room in Westminster debating an amendment to the Corn Laws that he could not now remember the substance of. She had been 7 months gone with their first child. The child, a girl, had not survived the hour. Charlotte had not survived the night. He had received the letter at 10:30 the following morning, had read it in the corridor outside the Lord's chamber, and had walked out of the building and into the rain without his coat, and stood in the street until Lord Fenton found him and put him in a carriage and took him home. He had arrived at Ashworth Park 3 days later and found the bedroom already cleaned, the linens already changed, the cradle already removed to the attic. The only thing left was Charlotte's ring, which the housekeeper had placed on the mantel in a small dish, and which he had threaded onto a chain and worn inside his waistcoat every day since, over his heart, where the weight of it was a penance he could carry without anyone seeing. He had not told anyone this. Lord Fenton knew about the rain and the carriage. The housekeeper knew about the ring. No one knew about the committee room, the amendment, the half-read letter, the 3 days on the road. No one knew that the coldness that Tunn attributed to temperament was not coldness at all. It was the discipline of a man who believed he had traded his wife's life for a parliamentary afternoon he could not even recall, and who had decided with the thoroughness of a man accustomed to making decisions that stuck, that he would not permit himself to want anything again. He had kept that decision for 2 years. He had kept it through 3 seasons, through Lady Bromley's campaign and Mrs. Pemberton's introductions, and the steady procession of beautiful, accomplished young women whose warmth felt like noise. He had kept it until a woman in a puckered lavender gown stood at a wall and counted candles with the specific stillness of someone who had learned to make herself invisible. And his body, which had been stone for 2 years, had recognized her before his mind permitted it. The recognition had terrified him. He had gone home from the Whitmore ball and taken off his coat, and stood at the window of his study and pressed his hand to the chain beneath his waistcoat, and told himself he was imagining it. He had almost believed himself. Then he had gone to the garden party and heard her reading Cowper to his godmother in a voice as patient as rain, and the almost had collapsed. The weeks that followed were an accumulation. He attended the events where she would be. He did not dance. He did not seek Cecilia. He found reasons to be in rooms where Margaret was placed at the edges, and he watched her with the particular discipline of a man who was trying not to want what he wanted, and failing by degrees. She fetched fans and held shawls and sat at walls and read to Lady Fenwick and pressed her palm flat against the cracked binding of the Cowper, and he saw every act of it, every small gesture of worth performed without audience, and each one was a stone laid in a wall he could no longer pretend he was not building. At the Bancroft supper, he found himself standing behind her chair and saying, "The pheasant is cold. Take the soup instead." She had looked up at him with those steady gray eyes and said, "I am quite capable of choosing my own supper, Your Grace." And he had said, "I did not say you were not," and walked away, and the back of his neck had been warm for the rest of the evening. At the Darnley tea, Margaret had been seated at the small table near the window, pouring for Lady Fenwick, when a gust from the open casement scattered the napkins across the floor. She had knelt to collect them, and when she rose, Halford was standing beside the table with the last napkin folded in his hand. He set it on the tray without a word. Their fingers did not touch. The distance between his hand and hers was no more than the width of a teaspoon, and Margaret felt it in her wrists, in the tendons of her fingers, in the sudden awareness that she knew exactly how tall he was, and exactly how his coat sat across his shoulders without having looked directly at either. At Lady Cresswell's card party the following evening, Cecilia played 21 with Lord Fenton, while Lady Bromley watched from a settee and calculated odds that had nothing to do with cards. Margaret stood by the window, her back to the room, watching the rain bead on the glass. Halford appeared beside her. He did not announce himself. He simply stood, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his sleeve near her bare arm, and looked at the rain with the same attention he might have given a landscape he was considering purchasing. "Do you always stand at windows, Miss Ellsworth?" he said. "Do you always appear at them, Your Grace?" she said. And the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, not quite. Something smaller and more costly. And she felt the heat of it spread from her face to the base of her throat, and was grateful for the rain-cooled glass against her hand. At the Cavendish rout, she tripped on the hem of the altered lavender gown, and he caught her arm, and his fingers closed around her wrist, and felt her pulse beating fast and thin beneath the cotton of her glove, and he held on for 1 second longer than rescue required. She pulled her arm free. She thanked him. He said nothing. The place where her pulse had beaten against his fingertips stayed warm for hours. Lady Bromley, who had been watching from across the room with the focused attention of a woman whose campaign was developing complications, turned to Mrs. Pemberton and said something behind her fan that Margaret could not hear and did not need to. Then the dark moment came, and it came from Lady Bromley's drawing room on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered with the efficiency of a woman who had finally understood that the Duke of Halford was not looking at Cecilia. Cecilia stood by the window, her face pale, her hands twisting the ribbon of her sash. Lady Bromley sat in the high-backed chair and told Margaret that her time in London was finished. "You have done what you were brought to do," Lady Bromley said. "You have filled a chair. Cecilia's prospects are established. I have written to your father's curate in Hartfield, and he has agreed to take you as a boarder until a position as governess can be found." Margaret stood in the center of the room and felt the floor tilt beneath her. "I have another 3 weeks of the season," she said. "You have nothing," Lady Bromley said. "The carriage will take you to the coaching inn tomorrow morning." Cecilia, at the window, turned and looked at Margaret, and her face carried something that was not triumph, and was not pity, and was closer to the expression of a woman who has just recognized the shape of a cage she had not known she was standing in. "Meg," she said, and then stopped, and then said, in a voice so quiet it was nearly a confession, "They are saying you are the one he watches, the plain one. They are all saying it." The third voicing landed, and Margaret felt it in her chest, in the place where her father's book rested when she held it close. The plain one. The label had followed her from Lady Bromley's whisper to Mrs. Pemberton's arbor to her cousin's mouth, and now it stood in the center of the drawing room like a verdict handed down by a court whose authority she had never accepted and could not refuse. She went to her room. She sat on the bed. She picked up the Cowper and opened it to the page where her father had written, in his fine ink, "She sees what others do not trouble themselves to look for." He had written it beside a passage about the winter garden, about the way snow reveals the shape of things that summer hides. She read it twice. She closed the book. She looked at the trunk at the foot of her bed, already half-packed by the housemaid who had been sent upstairs before the conversation was even finished, and she looked at the narrow window that faced the mews, and she looked at the single candle on the table that she had paid for herself, and she made a decision that had nothing to do with the Duke of Halford and everything to do with the woman her father had raised her to be. She was not going to leave London in the dark, escorted to a coaching inn like a piece of furniture being returned to storage. She was going to walk into the last ballroom of the season in the only gown she had, and she was going to stand where she chose to stand. And if the room decided not to see her, then the room would be wrong, and she would know it. And that would be enough. She put on the lavender gown, the one with the puckered seams, the one she had worn to the first ball of the season. She tucked her father's Cowper against her ribs, beneath the bodice, where the fabric was loose enough to hold it. She pinned her hair with the 2 pins she owned, and did not look in the glass, because she did not need the glass to tell her what the season had already decided. She walked out of Lady Bromley's house and into the evening, and went, on foot, to Lady Whitmore's end-of-season ball, where she had not been invited, and where no one was expecting her, and where, if she was fortunate, the Duke of Halford would be standing at the edge of the room with a glass of wine he was not drinking, being cold in the way that was not cold at all. The ballroom at Lady Whitmore's was lit with the same 300 candles. The same 400 guests filled the same silk chairs and crowded the same dance floor and laughed the same polished laughter that had filled this room 8 weeks ago when Margaret had stood at the eastern wall and counted the flames. The orchestra was playing a cotillion she recognized from the opening night, the same melody, the same tempo, as though the season had been wound back to its beginning and given another chance. She entered from the garden door because the front entrance required an invitation card she did not possess, and she stood at the edge of the room in her puckered lavender gown with her father's book pressed against her ribs beneath the fabric, and the crowd saw her and did not see her, because the crowd had never troubled itself to look. Lady Bromley was there. Her face, when she saw Margaret, went white, and then red, and then settled into the fixed expression of a woman whose machinery has been interrupted by a component she had believed was already removed. Mrs. Pemberton was beside her. Cecilia was standing near the refreshments in her ivory silk, and her eyes found Margaret across the room and held. And something in her face opened. A recognition that was not yet kindness, and was no longer cruelty and might, given time, become something like understanding. The Duke of Halford was standing at the western wall. He had a glass of wine. He had not tasted it. He had been watching the door for 7 minutes, which was 6 minutes longer than he had ever watched any door at any event in the 2 years since Charlotte's death. When Margaret appeared at the garden entrance in the lavender gown, his hand went to his chest, to the chain beneath his waistcoat, and then dropped. He set down the glass. He adjusted his coat. He crossed the room. The crowd, which had been a wall of sound, went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when a man of extreme rank does something no one has seen him do. He crossed the full length of the ballroom. He passed Cecilia. He passed Lady Bromley, whose mouth opened and produced no sound. He passed Mrs. Pemberton, whose assessment recalibrated itself mid-expression. He stopped in front of Margaret Ellsworth, in her puckered lavender gown, with her father's cowper pressed against her ribs, and the silence in the room was so complete that Margaret could hear the candles burning. He looked at her. She looked at him. His face was not cold. It was not composed. It was the face of a man who had spent 2 years carrying a ring over his heart as penance, and had just realized that penance was not the same as faithfulness, and that Charlotte, who had been warm and kind and alive, would never have asked him to be stone. "Miss Ellsworth will be my wife," he said, his voice low and level and carrying to every corner of that silent room. "If she will have me." The room erupted. Lady Bromley's hand found the back of the nearest chair, and she gripped it, and her carefully constructed confidence collapsed into something smaller and older and more honest than anything she had shown the season. Mrs. Pemberton looked at her hands. Lord Fenton, who had once called Margaret plain as a church wall, closed his eyes and had the decency to keep them closed. Cecilia, at the edge of the crowd, pressed her fingers to her mouth and made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cry, and was, Margaret understood with sudden and terrible clarity, the sound of a woman who has just been released from a campaign she had never wanted to win. The crowd murmured. Someone near the orchestra said, "The plain one?" and was silenced by 3 sharp looks from 3 women who had watched the entire crossing and understood, in the way that rooms sometimes understand, that they had been wrong. Margaret looked at him. The candles were burning above them, 300 of them, and she could have counted everyone. She did not count them. She looked at his face, which was open and unguarded, and more frightened than she had ever seen a man of his rank allow himself to be, and she said, "Yes, Your Grace." He offered his hand. She took it. His fingers closed around hers, and she felt the warmth of his palm through the cotton of her glove, and understood that this was not rescue. She had walked here on her own feet, in a gown that did not fit, with a book pressed against her ribs that contained the only voice that had ever told her she was worth seeing. He had not saved her. He had seen her. The difference was everything. The music began again. He led her onto the floor. The Duke of Halford, who had not danced in 2 years, danced with Margaret Ellsworth in her puckered lavender gown, and the room watched, and the room remembered. And Lady Bromley sat down in the nearest chair and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. 6 weeks later, on a morning in late July, Margaret stood at the window of the library at Ashworth Park and watched the light move across the Derbyshire hills. The room was warm. The shelves held 3,000 volumes, and the south-facing window was twice the size of the one in her father's cottage, and the desk where she had placed her father's cowper was made of walnut, so dark it looked like it had been carved from the heartwood of a very old tree. She had opened the book to the page with her father's annotation, the one about the winter garden, and she had placed it where the morning light would fall across his handwriting and make the fine ink glow. There were fresh flowers on the mantel, bluebells from the south meadow that the housekeeper had cut that morning without being asked, because the housekeeper had been Charlotte's housekeeper and understood without instruction that the new Duchess of Halford was the kind of woman who would notice bluebells and be grateful for them. The ring on her finger was new. The chain that had lived inside Edward's waistcoat for 2 years was now folded in a small dish on the mantel in their bedroom, not hidden, not worn as penance, placed where the morning light could find it. He had put it there on the first night, without ceremony, without explanation, and she had watched him do it and had not said a word, because some things do not need language. They need only a witness. Lady Fenwick had come to the wedding. She had sat in the front pew and wept openly, and eaten 3 pieces of cake afterward, each one cut small enough for her shaking hands to manage, and Margaret had cut every piece herself. Edward came into the library. He stood behind her at the window and looked at the hills, and did not speak. His hand found the small of her back, and she leaned into the warmth of him. And outside the window, a thrush was singing in the copper beech that shaded the south lawn, and the sound of it filled the library like something given freely and without condition. On the desk, her father's handwriting caught the light. She sees what others do not trouble themselves to look for. Margaret pressed her palm against the glass and felt the sun warm on her skin, and closed her eyes, and listened to the thrush, and to the sound of Edward's breathing beside her, and to the silence of a house that had stopped being a monument and had begun, very quietly, to become a home. Thank you for staying until the end. If Margaret's story moved something in you, leave a word in the comments. She would not ask for it. She never did.